All right, we're going to get started here. Bear with me for a moment if I'm still pausing to log people in as they join a few minutes late here. That does happen. For those who don't know me, my name is Darren Morgan, nursery manager here at Chenard's Nursery in Corvallis, Oregon. I've been doing this for a long time, and I wanted to take some time today to talk to you about growing caneberries or cane fruit. It's a topic that we get a lot of questions about at the garden center, and I thought we could kind of clear up some things and give you some tips on success with your cane fruit. So broadly, when we're talking about caneberries or cane fruit, what really are we talking about? Well, for the most part, cane fruit in Western Oregon, we're talking about blackberries and raspberries. They are different. They're not like blueberries, which really are a shrub, a woody plant. They're also not like herbaceous crops that grow a season, produce, and then die back. They're kind of in between. They're more of a perennial with a biennial production habit in general, and there's exceptions, and we'll talk about that a bit. What that means is for cane fruit, you get growth one year that does nothing but grow. You get growth off of that new growth the following year produces your flowers and fruit. When those canes, those kind of viney growths, have finished fruiting, they die completely, being replaced by new growth. And that makes the management of cane fruit just a little more technical than managing, say, strawberries or, say, blueberries. So cane fruits all of them have some things in common. They are generically acid loving. That being said, they're not super picky about it. They're not blueberries where you really need to get your soil acidity down below 5, but they don't do their best in alkali soils. They really do like at least some acidity. They're relatively hungry plants. They need a fair amount of nutrition. We'll talk about feeding them just another slide down. Because they are kind of viney cane growth habits, they will all require some degree of pruning and support to enable you to manage them. Now, it doesn't happen in the wild, of course. We see black raspberries growing in the wild, for example. They grow as a ground cover, laying out along the ground. Blackberries grow in dense thickets, only coming up above ground level as they climb on top of themselves or on top of other structures or other plants and smother them. So obviously, that doesn't happen in the wild. We do this support structure system to make them manageable. Because if we don't do this, you find it very hard to do anything with them or harvest them. And cane fruit are summer producers. Different cane fruits have slightly different cycles to that production. And we'll talk about that in more detail as we get into the specifics. General care and issues that apply to all cane fruit, all caneberries. They're hungry. They really need to be fertilized to produce well. Yes, you can neglect a stand of blackberries and you'll get some berries, but they won't be significantly productive. The real limiting factor for cane fruit is the available nitrogen. That determines how much cane production they can get, and thus how much sun they're acquiring, how much fruit, flower and fruit they can support. That's not to say they don't like some secondary nutrition, and having some phosphorus and potassium is certainly not bad for them. They do utilize it. I tend to use a comprehensive fertilizer. I like organic, so I do use an organic granular. And something that has a lot of nitrogen comparatively, but maybe not exclusively nitrogen. So organic fruit tree fertilizer that I use has got an 8-4-2 analysis. It is important when you're feeding caneberries to understand the root systems. So when you're looking at, pardon me, what I
want, where?
I
don't know.
No, you're gonna do that?
Well, I don't know if you're ready to do this. I should join in. He's frozen anyway.
It's not urgent.
Yeah. Okay. So the root systems are extensive. Now, raspberries grow in a dense patch. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so it's obvious you kind of need to feed the whole raspberry bed. Blackberries aren't necessarily like that. If you look at the crown of a blackberry, like a trailing blackberry, and all the growths coming out of there, you would think, well, we'll just put some fertilizer in a ring right around that crown. And that's not the appropriate way to feed caneberries. Blackberries have very, very extensive root systems. So you need to feed the entire root zone, or as much of it as you can readily reach. Because a lot of berries are grown in raised beds or in rows, it's kind of simple to say, well, feed the whole row. So blackberries can have root systems that reach 5 feet in all directions and up to 10 feet deep. This is one of the reasons they're so hard to get rid of when they become a problem. So you really do have to feed. If you're putting your blackberries on support structures and they're spacing those blackberries at 6 to 8 feet apart, you have to feed all the space in between those berries to get a good application of fertilizer on those plants. Watering is important. It does depend somewhat on what our natural moisture is in the early parts of the season, but as we get into summer and the dry weather, they will need consistency of irrigation. And with it's easy to forget on summer fruiting ones, early summer fruiting ones, that you need to continue that irrigation all the way through the summer, because that growth that they're putting on after this season's crop will be next season's crop. So you have to make sure it's in good health. An inch of water per week is recommended for blackberries, which is really typical about what you'd water a lawn or a vegetable garden roughly. Raspberries need almost twice as much. They're extremely thirsty. They're usually planted very dense, so they're constantly competing with each other for moisture. So up to maybe 2 inches a week during the real dry parts of the summer. So that requires relatively frequent waterings. If you're doing drip system, fairly long runs and running them every couple of days. You can't just go down to a 1 a week deep watering on raspberries. It doesn't do the job. Caneberries in general do not have tons and tons of disease and insect problems, especially compared to, like, for example, tree fruits that have lots of different insect problems and lots of different diseases. That's not to say they don't have any. There are a number, we'll talk at the end a bit about some of the pests and diseases you'll run into. There are a number of fungal diseases in particular they can get. In many cases, these diseases are so minor they don't really require active treatment or prevention. In some cases, prevention or even active treatment are advised. Insect problems are primarily in fruit problems or in cane problems, and there are a couple of both. And we'll talk a bit more in detail about that at the very end of the presentation. Just be aware that you don't necessarily need to get on an active spraying schedule with caneberries like you do, say, with peaches or even apples, unless you're having ongoing problems. You can often go years with no pesticide applications at all and still be successful, but you do need to pay attention because those problems do occur and should be dealt with when you're seeing those issues. All right, so some general information on caneberries. Let's move into a little bit more specifics. And this is where it all starts getting confusing because there's no one thing. Everything is kind of multiples. So blackberries. Most of the blackberries that are grown in Western Oregon, Western Washington, most of California, and similarly relatively mild climates are what are called trailing raspberries. And they are called trailing because they have a vine-like growth pattern that needs to be trained up on supports that way. This is all your hybrids too, all your like Boisons and Logans that are crossbreeds between blackberry and raspberry. So they all fruit on second year growth. You have a year of vine growth, and then the next year those vines produce the flowers and fruit. That is not the only type of blackberry out there. There are erect blackberries. This is what your wild blackberries are out here on the West Coast, but don't assume that all erect varieties are that. There are lots of commercially erect varieties. Commercially erect blackberries are used in climates that are too cold or inhospitable for growing trailing raspberries, or trailing blackberries, which is a lot of the Midwest and parts of the East Coast that are simply too cold for trailers. Typically trailing erect blackberries have very high very high growth rates. They've got a lot of vegetative growth that comes out from all over the root system instead of just from the central crown. Their yields are not as high as trailing blackberries. And while the flavors can be very, very good, they tend to be seedier and of generically lower market quality. That's why where trailing blackberries can be grown, they become the default production blackberry. In between are the semi-erect blackberries. These have a lot of fun things to do with them. They tend to be better behaved than erect blackberries, but similar in that they tend to have a thickening expansion from the root system. Their quality of fruit is similar to erect blackberries, but somewhat better. Flavor quality can be very good. Semi-erect are some of the most productive of any blackberries. And many of them are primocane fruiting, which we'll cover that term a little bit later. Just simply means they actually fruit on the first year's growth late in the summer and into fall. So you can manage them a little differently than you do other blackberries. So those are the basic types, and there's individual varieties. We'll talk a little bit more a couple of slides down about some of the individual varieties. But each of those types of blackberries have some specific pruning that goes with them. Otherwise, watering is kind of the same, feeding is kind of the same. When you're harvesting your blackberries, you're going to be out there picking them every 3 or 4 days is pretty typical. Single season blackberries, the vast majority of them out there, will have maybe a 4-week production cycle. The tendency on harvesting blackberries is to accidentally damage a lot of them by trying to pull them off of the vine. Ripe blackberries should snap when turned. They should break off. You're not trying to pull a capsule out like you do with raspberries. So break the berries off. Don't try to pull them off. If they're not breaking off readily, they're not ripe or they have other issues going on. They don't hold well. Blackberries are a fresh fruit. You can freeze them or you can process them into something, but they don't hold fresh for fresh use more than just a few days after picking. An individual blackberry might produce around 10, 12, maybe 15 pounds of fruit per year. So plan accordingly for how much you want to plant, and can live maybe 20 years or so. Blackberries are relatively tolerant of heavier, wetter soils and relatively tolerant of shade. That does not mean you should plant them in wet, deep shade environments. It means if you have sites that are less than ideal, that are a little bit heavy in clay soil, making it challenging to grow raspberries, for example, or that don't really get a full day of sun, but get reasonable amounts of sun, blackberries are a good candidate. They are more tolerant than almost any other fruiting crop. Pruning always becomes the question for blackberries, and pruning, how you prune blackberries will intimately affect how and where you install them. So we've got some guidelines here. I want to encourage you. I've got a lot of text, more than I usually do on a slide. We're going to go over it, but this will all be posted on our YouTube channel too. If you want to review and spend some time on that text, feel free to go back and review it and get a little more depth of what's showing on the screen. So trailing blackberries, the new growth comes out as very light, viney growth, and right from the crown. So it's a central crown. All of your new growth is coming out right adjacent to the crown. It's growing in all directions as very rapid growing vines. So you need to control those so that you're not constantly walking on them, tripping on them, or otherwise damaging them. And the simplest way to do that is to rake them or direct them into the row. Now, as you can see on the training diagram here, trailing blackberries have a lot of vine growth, and they're usually trained up on a couple of wires. It's really common to set a series of posts about 8 feet apart with 2 wires between each post, one at about 6 feet and one at about 4 feet. And then you'll train that growth onto those wires. You don't do that right away because you have last year's growth on those wires now that will be producing fruit in July. So that's where it gets complicated. You have last year's growth up on the wires, producing fruit. When that fruit is done, you want to leave those growths on the wire through most of the summer or even all summer, keeping them fed, keeping them irrigated so that they can photosynthesize. They can use all that leaf mass they've got generated to store that energy back into the root system. As they significantly die down and become brittle, usually late summer to early fall, then you remove all of those viney growths from last year, the ones that had fruit this year, clear back at the cane, at the crown, basically next to ground level. Over that time period when you've been harvesting the fruit and then letting those old canes grow, all that new growth has been growing and getting longer and longer, 8, 10, 12 feet of vine growth. After you remove the last year's production canes in the late summer to fall, you can take all of that new growth that you've been carefully keeping out of everybody's way in the row, lift it up and train it in these loose spirals on the wires, again, to be next year's crop. So that's really the trick to those guys, is control the new growth, but don't try to replace the old growth until it has done its job and returned its energy back to the root system. Now, there are some minor variations in this, and thank you, Susan, for speaking out of where you're from. In climates that are warm enough to successfully grow trailing blackberries, but cold enough that winter damage on the canes is a significant risk, it is much more common to leave those trailing vines, the primal canes, on the ground through the winter, and even throw a little mulch over them, such as a little bit of straw mulch over them. Then you can lift them up in the late winter to spring as growth begins to go again. It's a little bit more of a pain to do it that way. It's why we don't unless we have to, because you'll find that those have rooted in at various points along there, and you have to kind of pick them up and untangle them. But it's a way to manage them in climates where training them on the wires in September will result in a lot of cane damage from freezing weather over the course of the winter. So trailing blackberries are a bit of a pain to feed as well because of all that viney growth. We like to feed in basically three batches, April, May, and June. So apply your fertilizer at the recommended rates according to your bag directions. The first couple of feedings are easy. That last feeding, you've got a lot of vine growth. You need to make sure you're getting that fertilizer off the leaves and vines and down onto the soil where it does some good. So that's the basics on trailing blackberries. Erect and semi-erect behave differently. Pretty much all erect and most semi-erects produce also on floricanes, on second year growth. So what that means is you have a relatively stocky batch of growth coming up, not just from the crown, but also from the surrounding root system, much more extensively on erect, less extensively on semi-erect, that are intermingling with last year's growth that you've been pulling the fruit off of. To get good fruit production on erect and semi-erect blackberries, you want them to do some side branching later into their growth cycle, later into the summer, rather than spending all their energy putting lots of tip growth out with very few spots where new flowers and buds can come out the next year. So you have an established bushy structure with semi-erect or more or less erect canes, just trained to wires or trained to posts. It's as common to use a 2-wire system for trailing for erects as you do with trailers. But it's also common to simply put a T-post, a T-shaped post right at the point of the blackberry and just kind of use it to lie them on and tie them up to because they're not as viney. So you have those old canes up and they are producing, again, for the most part, June, July, August, depends somewhat on the varieties there. And those canes will die back, but you've already got new growth coming up through them. As that new growth starts reaching a reasonable height, 4 or 5 feet is fine, begin clipping the tips of the new growth, not the old growth. That will make that new growth pause a minute and put some energy into the side branches. And that's where the bulk of your production comes next year, is from the little lateral growths off of there. Now, those new growths, those new primal canes coming up, don't all grow at the same rate. So that means you need to kind of get out there every couple of weeks, 3 to 4 times over the growing season, or the later part of the growing season especially, and tip back anything that's exceeding your desired height. That will create some nice, stocky, well-branched canes to be next year's fruit production. In the meantime, we talk about the production cycle still being that midsummer, July production. It's real typical. On the old canes, we normally do not take off the old flora canes right after fruiting. Again, we would love them to store their energy back into the root system. We will normally do that in the winter. It's pretty easy, even with all the leaves gone and everything, to tell the difference between your current year's primal canes, that will be your next year's fruit crop, and your old canes, because they've gone brown and brittle. It's pretty easy to distinguish them. And that's, you remove all of those all the way back at ground level. So erect blackberries, this is quite a chore. There's a lot of them. Semi-erect, it's an in-between thing. You've got to deal with a fair amount of them, but not as many as with the erect varieties. Some erect varieties are noted as primocane fruiting, or first-year fruiting blackberries. You don't want to tip those anywhere near as much. You would really like them to just grow up and fruit, and then after the fruiting cycle, you can remove the portions of the cane that fruited, and you're likely to have the second crop on your flora canes the next year. It is inherently possible to manage these for an alternate year production as well on erects and on trailers, or to simply prune really hard and only have the very late crop on primocane fruiters. And it's often the best way to manage primocane fruiting semi-erect varieties. All the way to ground level every year, grow from ground level up and fruit late summer to fall and be done. So some varieties. Don't take this as comprehensive. There are a lot of varieties out there. You'll note that there are not a lot of erect and semi-erect varieties on here. Being in Western Oregon, we do focus heavily on the trailing varieties. Marionberry is still the dominant berry in the marketplace, with good reason. It's a champion flavored variety with consistently good yields. It's made Oregon blackberries very famous. There are some newer varieties out that are beginning to replace Marion in commercial production. The Columbia series, Columbia Star and Columbia Sunrise in particular, are getting a lot of attention because they have the flavor and quality of the Marion, with more consistent fruit size, making commercial harvest easier. Not such an important thing for the home gardener, though. And they tend to be thornless, making them a little easier to manage. Tays and Boisons are very unique raspberry blackberry crosses because of their growth habits and because of the way the fruit is broken off rather than pulled off of the core. They're considered blackberries, and you can grow them just as blackberries. Boison is a kind of a purple berry with a very unique appearance and flavor. You will never mistake Boisons for anything else. I'm a big fan of Tays myself. Tay berries are there was a very complex breeding program to develop a specific blackberry, and then they crossed it with a wild raspberry in Scotland. Produced a very high quality fruit with very good flavor. It never really caught on commercially, mostly because the yields never measured up to other blackberry varieties. So if flavor is more important than volume, consider doing Tays. There are some good semi-erect varieties out there. Galaxy comes to mind. Triple Crown is probably the most widely used in our area still. And so lots of good varieties out there. I would encourage you, pretty much, it's hard to go wrong with a trailing blackberry in Western climates, where you're mild enough to grow them, and all of them are pretty good. There are some individual characteristics that may limit your choices. For example, Marions are kind of disease prone. You may actually need to spray them more frequently. On the other hand, the Columbias are a little less wet soil tolerant. You may have some issues with that. So when in doubt, consult with your local nurseryman about what you're trying to get out of them, and they should be able to direct you to a variety that suits for you. So that covers the basics on blackberries. Raspberries break into mostly 3 groups. Black caps, black raspberries, are floricane fruiting, so fruiting on second year's growth vines that really grow like a blackberry. We assume that you're treating a black raspberry as if you were treating a semi-erect blackberry, and you'll be spot on. They'll be very, very effective for you. So same pruning, same basic feeding. The more traditional red and or golden raspberries are broken into two groups. Groups that only produce on the floricane, what they call spring crop varieties, and their harvest is sometime in June through maybe mid to late July, or ever-bearing varieties. And ever-bearing varieties can produce that early summer crop. It's usually a kind of not a huge crop, but it's there if pruned appropriately to do that. But they have their most significant harvest usually starting in August and running clear up to frost. We say September, but I've seen them producing well into October many years on the primocanes, on the new growth coming up. It is real common for homeowners in particular who are doing ever-bearing varieties to simply not bother with the June, July crop, mow everything to the ground every year, and just have the fruiting on the tips in the late summer crop, because that is the main crop. Yellows, every yellow I've run into, and there might be some exceptions, every yellow I've run into is an ever-bearing variety. Purple varieties are treated as ever-bearing varieties, but the blacks are different. So raspberries have a fairly long production cycle relative to blackberries. Your raspberry cycle is usually around 5 weeks. Can be a little bit longer. Runs from June through the end of July. On spring crop varieties, you want to pick every 2 or 3 days to avoid losing berries, getting overripe. When they are ripe, they readily pull off the core. A very light traction will pull them off of the white core left behind on the plant. If it's taking any substantial amount of pressure to get them off, they're probably not quite ripe yet. Just like with blackberries, they don't have any storage life fresh. You can freeze them for longer term storage, or you can use them in something immediately. Raspberries can be quite productive, 2 to 3 pounds per foot of row. They do grow very dense like an erect blackberry. So all along the root system, you'll constantly be getting suckers coming up. That's critical for maintaining them, because that new growth has to be maintained, but also has to be thinned. Raspberries don't live as long as blackberries. 15-year stand is really pushing the limits. 10 to 12 years is much more common. You will see a decline in productivity somewhere in that range. You're also likely to have increasing disease problems. Now, we said at the outset that caneberries don't have a lot of serious disease problems in general, but raspberries are really prone to root rot in heavy, wet soils. To the point that here in Corvallis, it usually means building raised beds to grow raspberries. They do not grow well in heavy, wet clay. They need drainage. So root rot is a serious concern. It's usually addressed not by trying to treat it, but by trying to prevent it by providing adequate drainage for the grounds. So, as we've mentioned with the blackberries, the spring crop varieties produce on the second year canes. So you'll have primal canes, first year canes growing up from ground level all over the stand. You want to thin those to a reasonable spacing. 6 or 8 inches between a developing canes is a good spacing to allow for air circulation in there, and to remove any that have cane borers or that are broken. Anything like that is your focus during that growing stage. In the winter, in the dormant cycle, you can go through and do some tipping on them. You want to cut the tops out just a few inches out of the tips to encourage good branching next year. So the stems you leave up over the winter, set side spurs that produce your fruit the next summer, June or July. Like with blackberries, those floricanes will begin to die off after they've fruited, but they have a period in between the fruit production and they're dying off when they're actually contributing energy back into the root system. So we leave them up, letting the new growth come in behind them, the new growth thinned out and again tipped as it gets up to a reasonable height. Reasonable maintenance height for raspberries is usually about 4 feet. Don't let your canes get substantially taller than that, or don't try to keep your canes substantially taller than that going into the next season. So everbearing types you can maintain for that crop or not. It's really simple to just mow them all in the winter, and all the new growth comes up, just thin it and have your late summer, your August, September crop. But if you want to get both cycles, you have to do the same thing. You have to prune them like a June crop variety, a spring crop variety, where you get the floricanes up, you let them fruit, you leave them up as the new growth comes through, you remove them in the late summer to fall as they begin to die down. And so you can kind of see this on the pictures here. Fall-bearing raspberries set fruit on the tips of the canes on the first-year canes. If you're managing them only for fall production, in the winter you prune them all the way back to ground level, and the new growth comes up, you thin it, maintain its health. Summer-bearing raspberries or ever-bearing varieties that you're also focusing on the summer crop for set fruit on side branches on the second-year canes. New growth comes up through those canes. After the fruit cycle and after some summer growth, late in the summer, early fall, you'll remove all of those older canes, meantime keeping your thinned new growth canes. For everbearing varieties, those will have fruit on them. For June crop varieties or spring crop varieties, those will not fruit this year. It will be your fruit production next year. It's always harder to explain this verbally than to actually do it. You do it a couple of times and you'll have a solid feel for it. It sounds complicated, but it becomes relatively clear when you get out there in the field and got hands on them. Raspberry varieties. So there's a number of good June crop varieties, focuses on heavy productivity and excellent fruit quality. You cannot get any everbearing varieties that taste as good as the June crop varieties. One of the reasons people often do both. Cascade Delight is a new summer crop variety with really high quality and size of fruit and excellent disease resistance. It's one of the things they've been breeding for lately, is to improve the cane, some of the cane disease resistances, in particular, some root rot tolerance. Tulamine is an older variety. It is widely considered to be the best flavored raspberry on the market. Everbearing varieties, there's a lot of good ones out there as well. Traditional in our area are Amity and also Heritage. Not a big Heritage fan myself. I find the berries a little on the mild side, but they're very productive. Canes are very large and rigid and self-supporting. Caroline's a newer variety. It has an extended harvest season. So most everbearing varieties, you have a distinct June, July, a significant pause, and then an August through fall cycle. With Carolines, with kind of an extended harvest season, the two seasons almost run together, making them almost completely, truly everbearing, producing over the entire season. Flavor and productivity are good. Some improvements on disease tolerance on Caroline as well, but not on root rot, unfortunately. Vintage, a newer variety. It's the first everbearing variety that's really getting up there into the flavor quality of the June crop varieties. And again, some disease resistance. There's been a lot of breeding going on in these cane fruits just in the last few years. There's some fun, unusual varieties to play with. Black varieties, Jewel is a solid, it's one of the better producing black raspberries. One of the big challenges with black raspberries is they're just simply not very productive, and they can be kind of seedy, kind of like the we talked about with the erect blackberries. Jewel has still a fair amount of seeds, but it's bigger berries, so they're hidden a little better and more productive than many black raspberries. You'll also see a fair number of old Cumberlands and Mungers out there. They're still fairly good berries in this area, but I'm a fan of Jewel. If you like golds, you can find Fall Gold, a consistently good everbearing fall yellow variety. Anne is probably superior in overall flavor, though not necessarily in productivity. So we said that these don't have a lot of disease problems, but diseases do occur. The obvious ones are things like mildew and botrytis bunch rot on the berries, rots on the fruit. A lot of those problems can be avoided by watering at the roots and by doing a good job of sanitation, so cleaning up all your prunings. Improving your air circulation, pruning to thin, to open out your stands for better air circulation. Real common to get a variety of leaf and even small cane blights on blackberries in particular, less common on raspberries, where you have the spots on the leaves. There often be a purple or a brown spot with a yellow or a brown center. Center may fall out even, maybe accompanied by very dark lesions on the cane itself. Some varieties are really prone to that. Both Logan and Marion are noted for being fairly prone to some of these spot diseases. Small amounts of spot disease are seldom worth treating. They're not doing much damage, and they go away when you remove the old canes and clean them up the next year. If you're getting a significant amount of spotting happening on your primal canes during their first year of growth, or anytime where you're seeing large amounts of the spots on canes and leaves, it would be worthwhile to treat. You can treat during the active season with biological fungicides like Moderate Complete Disease Control or Sonata. You can also, if you've got a history of this happening, or if your growing varieties are simply more prone, like Marion berries, you can do preventive sprays just like we do with fruit trees and hit those canes in the winter, in the dormant season, with copper or sulfur fungicides as preventatives. It's not a bad practice to do. Many caneberries don't need it, but when it's an ongoing problem, that will reduce the population of disease present. Root rots. So this is a real problem on raspberry in poor drainage. Symptomology is challenging because what you see with the dying out, the whole browning, dying out entire canes at a time, also happens naturally with floricanes at the end of the season, where they do go brittle and brown. Also happens with certain disease insect problems like crown borers and to some extent cane borers. So diagnostically can be a little challenging. Generally speaking, if you have any question about the quality of soil and drainage, and you're seeing patchy, irregular whole plant dying out, you probably have root rot. Root rots are not treatable. You remove the affected plants, hopefully keep the stand going, and you plan on doing a new planting in a different location with an improved site later. See if you can keep them going long enough to be worthwhile, because you just can't really do much about it except cull out the affected plants. That brings to mind another comment on cane fruits and diseases. We talked about the lifespan at maybe 10 to 12 years or so on raspberries, and maybe 20 or so on blackberries. When you're at the end of a cycle, on a life cycle on a plant like that, and you're taking them out, you really should not use that area to replant more caneberries. You should find a new location. Disease pressure builds up over repeated plantings in the same soil. Strawberries share a lot of diseases with blackberries and raspberries. So do nightshade vegetables like tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. So when you take out a stand of blackberry or raspberry, that bed should not be used for nightshade vegetables, strawberries, or other caneberries for basically 2 years. Do other things, leaf crops, broccoli, cauliflower, legumes, something else for a couple of years to allow that soil to recover from the disease pressure. Bugs. Okay, so in fruit pests, we have a number of fruit flies. The dominant one lately has been the spotted wing Drosophila, SWD. It's kind of a new pest to our area. It goes through several generations per year, moving from fruit crop to fruit crop and into some of the wild berries and fruits as well. Typically, populations are fairly dense. They hit the berries as sugar's really developing in them right near harvest. They lay their eggs inside, the worms develop inside the fruit. If you were out there in the raspberry patch picking and eating out of your hand, even if you got spotted wing Drosophila in them, you'd probably never notice. But you bring them in the house and you sit them for a day or two and you start seeing the fruit just collapse from the worms developing and eating inside. So this has been a hit and miss problem in home crops. On the commercial scale, it's been a fairly significant issue. There are sprays, organic sprays. You can use neem or you can use spinosad as insecticides, both organic insecticides. Timing of that is critical. If you're thinking you're having ongoing problems with spotted wing Drosophila, it's worth stopping by the nursery and in your area and getting a recommendation on exact timing, because they are a year through pest. You have to time it right to actually get good control. Cane borers. We have raspberry cane borer, and more commonly in the stems like this, we see actually a rose cane borer. Does very similar damage. First symptom you'll usually see with borers, either cane or crown borers, is you will see the characteristic J-hook shape. The new growth will be coming up, and then it'll start hooking over. That's usually a sign of a borer, so you start looking through. If you see the swollen galls on the stems, those are either raspberry cane borer or more commonly rose cane borer here, and you simply prune out the gall. The insect is inside the gall. Crown borers are more problematic. You'll start off with the J hooks, but then pretty rapidly that whole stem will collapse. So with the crown borers, and the adult crown borer is completely different. Adult crown borer looks like a big yellow jacket. It's a yellow jacket mimic. That's one of the ways it avoids predation, but it's actually a type of clear-winged moth. And the larvae bore down into the crowns. And on raspberries, it's pretty straightforward. You've got a J-hooked plant that then dies back. Well, you just grub out that cane, and it's a little attached point of soil, and you're removing that grub out, and it's pretty straightforward. You cull them. Blackberries, because especially on trailing blackberries, your crown is the plant. And if you get crown borers in a trailing blackberry, you have to remove the whole plant basically to get rid of the crown borer. So it can wipe out your whole planting. The good news is, unless it's a very old stand, you can replant. Treatments for crown and cane borer are usually pruning and culling. Chemical treatments are not super effective and have to be done very, very precisely to have any effect at all. So prune out cane borers and grub out crown borers. To decrease your problems with crown borers, control your wild blackberries. This is the biggest single host of crown borer, and they spread from the wild blackberries then into your raspberries or into your commercial blackberries with some consistency. So that's what I had for you today on basic education on cane fruit. If you have any follow-ups or you didn't remember something you wanted to ask, you can always get me here at Chenard's on the phone or via email, darren@chenards.com. This video will be posted up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. Feel free to review it or to see any of our other lovely educational videos we've done over the last couple of COVID years. Thank you for attending. I really appreciate it. Have a good day.